Hi everyone, this is Jan from VOQUZ. We've started the broadcast of today's webinar. We are just going to hold for a few minutes. We can see a lot of people actively joining the session. So I'm going to go on mute for a few more minutes and just till the numbers start settling down, but it'll only be a couple of minutes wait until we get started. Thanks everyone who's joined so far. Hello again to anyone who's just joined us in the last minute or so. We're still getting a high number of people actively joining the session at the moment, so just going to give it another minute or so before we kick off the webinar. Back with you shortly. Hi again, everyone. Numbers are starting to settle down, so I guess we can get started. So welcome to everybody who's joined. Welcome to this webinar by VOQUZ Labs, how to prepare for an annual SAP license audit. My name is Jan Cook. I'm UK Director for Advisory for VOQUZ Labs, and I'm joined by my colleague Francisco Hansen, who's Global Director for Advisory. So we will be presenting to you today. Just a reminder that we do have the questions tab, so please use that if you have any questions at all about the licensing subject, the content that we cover, or license audits as a whole. Please use the questions function, and we'll address those as we go through the webinar. We also have a poll, so I'll do a brief introduction to VOQUZ Labs, and we'll ask a quick question to the audience before we get fully started. So without further ado, little introduction about VOQUZ Labs. We are the leading global provider of dedicated licensing and authorization and compliance management solutions for SAP. We do have over 400 clients globally, and today we have offices all over the world, including Berlin, New York, Amsterdam, Mexico, London, Cape Town. Our flagship product is samQ. We launched in 2010, followed by the launch of our SETQ product in 2018, which is an SAP security and authorizations management product. Our solutions, as mentioned, include samQ License Optimizer, which is our SAP license management software, and SETQ, which is our authorization management product. We also have an advisory practice helping customers with SAP licensing and security. On the licensing side, we use our software to deliver advisory services such as licensing review, audit prep, digital access evaluation, and S/4HANA license migration. On the security side, we do things like compliance checks and role optimization projects. If you're interested to learn more about what we do and keep up to date with all of today's latest SAP licensing topics, you should subscribe to our blog and our LinkedIn page. Our blog is on our website at www.voquuzlabs.com/blog, and there we have lots of interesting articles about all of today's most pertinent licensing topics. A little introduction to the webinar agenda. So we're going to give a licensing summary so we understand what is subject to an annual SAP license audit. We're going to talk about license audits themselves, go through the license audit process, and we're going to then talk about audit preparation best practices. So before we get into the presentation itself, I'm just launching a quick poll to the audience, and that poll is, are you currently concerned about an up and coming SAP license audit? Do you currently have any concerns about licensing compliance, what the outcome of an audit might be? Are you concerned about indirect access, for example? Use the poll if you can. We have 50% voted so far, so if you haven't voted, get your vote in, and we'll close that off and we'll let you guys know the outcome. Okay, so yep, that's just about everyone who has voted. So we're going to close the poll. Interestingly, I can share the results. So as we can see, it's a bit of a 50-50 split. So we have half the audience pretty comfortable with their licensing position or the process of a licensing audit. Half of the audience, though, concerned in some way about what might be fast approaching. So that's obviously very interesting. So hopefully it'll be of value to both sides of the poll result. So first of all, like I said, we're going to go into a quick summary of SAP licensing. So most of you will be familiar that SAP is licensed on a dual licensing model. You need a package license, which entitles you to deploy and use specific software functionality. And you need user licenses, and a user license entitles a user to deploy and use specific licensed software. In addition to that, we also have indirect access. Now, traditionally, indirect access would be licensed via user license and package. So an indirect user may well need a user license based on how they're using third-party applications. And depending on what functionality is being used in SAP ERP, a package license might also be required. Most of you will be familiar now with the term digital document licensing. So in an effort to simplify this, SAP have launched this new digital document licensing model, and that means customers are licensing indirect use of SAP via the number of digital documents created, and there are a number of different chargeable documents. And if you subscribe to that particular licensing model, you would be audited on that going forward. License audits explained. So we'll take a little look first at license audits. An annual license audit is different to an enhanced license audit. There are two different types of audit. One is not really an audit, it's a self-declaration to SAP. An enhanced license audit, on the other hand, is conducted by the vendor. So some of the key differences: an annual license audit, by its namesake, occurs every year. It's a self-declaration of usage by the licensee to the vendor. It's based on the licensee's own configurations. It's of limited scope. The vendor has no access to your systems, and there isn't really scope for any deep dive analysis. Indirect access, some basic indirect access data is shared, but nothing major. An enhanced license audit occurs upon provision of notice according to your contract. Audit of software use is performed by the vendor themselves. It involves the auditor's inspection of system configurations. Any product can be included in the scope, and they do have the right to access your systems, whether that be on-site or remotely, and can involve more detailed analysis, such as looking at things like assigned authorizations as a basis for determining licensing, and can involve a full review of indirect access. This is what a self-declaration or annual audit request looks like. You receive a measurement request email with the various components of the measurement request. On the other hand, an enhanced license audit is a very detailed document, normally about 9 to 12 pages long, and it literally lists all of the deliverables and next steps involved in the enhanced license audit. Here you can see things like business objects, HANA. We've got number 8, system data extracts, so they're making bespoke requests for information, process diagrams, digital document counts, and all manner of different stuff that they're going to analyze to determine a more detailed view of licensing compliance. The annual audit cycle itself, many customers participate in the annual audit. The demand is self-declared to SAP. Gaps will be identified. New orders are raised to true up for licenses that are missing. The license level increases, the maintenance base increases, and the annual maintenance fees goes up. And of course, year on year, you're aggregating additional levels of entitlement. What we tend to find is if customers are practicing good license management and they're effectively preparing for an annual license audit, this can help prevent over licensing. Normally, when we do analysis with our tools, we identify a customer's actual effective licensing position, and that can be considerably lower than the actual license level, meaning customers are buying too much licenses and paying too much on annual maintenance. So the license audit process itself involves SAP sending the measurement request by email. The customer performs a measurement. They send the data back to SAP. Auditors review that data and present findings. And then there's a number of different license audit closing processes depending on the outcome of that review. So step 1, the measurement request is sent to the customer via email. The measurement request contents include the measurement instructions, i.e. how to carry out the measurement, a measurement plan, what needs to be measured, a measurement data file, which you can upload to LAW to help you, import the correct measurement and data files from all the relevant measurable systems, the self-declaration sheet for non-measurable products, and support notes that help fix common measurement errors that might affect the products being measured. The system measurement is then performed by the customer. A transaction called USMM is used to extract usage data from each system in your environment. Those data files are then imported into SAP's license administration workbench, or more commonly known as license audit workbench. That produces an LAW report, which is a single consolidated view of software usage across all relevant installations. So go through all those points. Once LAW has produced that report, we send the data off to SAP. An auditor will review that data. So SAP review the usage data in the LAW report. They compare that to the customer's licensing entitlements. Conclusions are made regarding any license gaps, and findings are then sent back to the customer. Typically, these findings will be presented in something called a measurement summary report. Then we have a number of different closing processes. That does include no response received. If you find yourself in that situation, you should always seek formal notification of the result of the audit and seek formal closure of the audit process. SAP could respond, but highlighting no licensing gaps. Beware though that that doesn't mean you're compliant. Just because they haven't highlighted a license gap doesn't mean there isn't one there that hasn't been noticed or spotted, or there could be other strategic account management reasons why they wouldn't want to raise a compliance issue. So make sure you read your reports to identify any potential gaps. In the other scenario, of course, there could be a license gap and there will be charges for additional fees, or an annual license audit might result in an enhanced license audit. So if there are particular findings that suggest to SAP there's more to be found, they may then initiate a more detailed investigation. So again, just because SAP don't highlight gaps, it doesn't mean there are none. Customers who manage licenses effectively should be aware of licensing gaps ahead of an audit and should be able to license proactively, making the license audit process go much smoother. And customers should always review their audit reports in detail in case of any missed findings. So here we're going to talk about the preparation steps themselves. So to prepare for an annual license audit, the first thing you want to do is law configuration. That's actually setting up SAP's license audit workbench. You want to implement any relevant support notes that are going to improve the accuracy of the measurement. Review the measurement scope so you know what's being measured. You want to classify your users correctly and compliantly in accordance with the contracts to make sure you're properly and right licensed. Review all your SAP engines or packages. Get indirect access ready. And then before you send anything to SAP, you want to perform a simulation so you know what it is that you're sending before you send it. So first of all, LAW configuration. LAW needs to be configured properly before it is used. This helps ensure most accurate measurement results. For the first measurement, LAW would have to be fully configured from scratch. Although any subsequent measurements, LAW configurations should be reviewed right through just to make sure everything is up to date and correct. This will help minimize errors, and you can find information on SAP support portal to help with LAW configuration. Or of course, if you're unsure, you can always ask a VOQUZ Labs expert for help. Once an LAW configurations and settings have been validated, obviously you can carry on with the process. As for installing SAP support notes are provided with the measurement request. These should be reviewed to identify notes that are relevant to the products that are in scope of the audit. There isn't much point in implementing a note if it's not going to affect the products being measured. These relevant notes should be installed only if they fix a measurement issue. So in fact, a note may relate to a certain product, but installing that note might actually change the functionality of LAW to your detriment. So just make sure when you're implementing a note, you have to understand what change the note will have. You have to make sure notes align with the specific license metrics in your SAP contracts. For example, it might be updating the metric or the measurement value that the LAW is measuring. So you have to make sure that any notes you implement are actually going to be corrective notes for your SAP systems. Once you've installed all relevant and validated support notes, you've got to make sure you do that before you run the measurement itself. And once they're installed, you can carry on. So reviewing the measurement scope, that's very important to make sure you understand what it is that's being measured, the process you're going to fulfill. The measurement request contains a table of all systems to be measured. This will include the installation ID, system type, and system name. It should also contain a measurement scope data file that can be imported into LAW. This helps customers manage the collection of relevant systems usage data. It also helps perform the measurement in accordance with the measurement plan. So you should review that plan thoroughly to understand the systems that are in scope. Make sure all systems are measured to avoid future compliance issues. You need to make sure all license relevant installations are on the measurement plan. It is possible that installations have been missed. So you should declare that to SAP and make sure all license relevant installations are featured on the plan. and make sure they are measured to make sure that not only you know what your usage of the SAP software is, but that you avoid potential future licensing and compliance issues. This is probably the most important and poignant part of the presentation. User licenses can account for up to 75% of an SAP customer's license estate. So classifying users before an audit is obviously very important. If you can do that routinely throughout the year, you won't have to do as much work coming up to an audit, but you must absolutely check that classifications are correct before the audit itself. So managing user licensing effectively, that's critical in controlling and optimizing costs. Customers are required to maintain user classifications in each system to reflect their activity. LAW will identify the highest prevailing user classification for each user, but it cannot determine if a user classification is suitable or not. LAW is based purely on the customer's own configurations. So if you tell LAW that a user is a professional, it counts that and reports it back to SAP. That's a customer's own self-declaration of what a user's license should be, but LAW cannot determine in any way if you've actually done those classifications correctly or not. So SAP tools themselves only provide a means to classify users and not any intelligence to help determine what the correct user classification is. Customers must do this themselves in accordance with the SAP contracts. So the objectives overall are to make sure users are compliant, optimized, and up to date. Compliant means they have an appropriate license level. Optimized means they have the cheapest compliant license type available. And up to date means that their classification is regularly reviewed so that the classification is always an accurate reflection of the license level that user needs. So how do we license SAP users? Well, each SAP user has a business role that will correspond to roles in the SAP system, the roles that they perform, and each user must have a named user license corresponding to what they do in the SAP system. The problem is there are so many different types of user license. How are you supposed to know which user license to allocate to each user? This is a list showing some of the most common user license types from today's price list. Most customers are licensing between 6 and 8 different user license types, but with each one having different use rights and definitions in the SAP contract, it can be difficult to manually classify a user if you don't have any means of correlating the contractual definition to what an SAP user is actually doing. So some of the standard classification options you have with standard SAP tools, you can use a user list that can allow you to classify a single user or a group of users with a specific user type. You would have to first identify that user or that group of users belong to a certain type, and you can then use that function to classify those users accordingly. You can perform mass change. Mass change only lets you do one-to-one user changes. So for example, all employees change to professional, or all manager self-service change to employee. So mass change is a straight one-to-one swap. And again, you have to tell the system, or you have to make the decision as to who is being changed to a different user type. Migration of price list is useful when you're mapping existing license types to new user types in a new price list. So if you've changed price list, you might want to do a mapping exercise. Then you can execute the function, and it will simply migrate all your users to that new price list. A reference user, you can use that. You can set up a template, and all new users will be set up in accordance to that reference user template. So based on there being multiple business roles in an SAP company, you'd have to have numerous reference users to actually satisfy business demand. You can do role-based mapping, but that involves classifying every role configured in every SAP system accordingly. You can use other functions like user data analysis, but this really only gives you some basic flags as to, telling you that you may need to review a user's classification because it looks like they might be a professional or a limited, but again, it does not tell you that that's the case. USMM also has some useful warnings again flagging that you may need to review certain classifications, but it still doesn't tell you what those classifications should be. So these options are tools for changing classifications of users. They don't provide means to determine what classifications should be. A customer needs to determine these themselves in accordance with the contracts. The methods are very manual orientated and can be time consuming and laborious, and especially across complex landscapes with numerous SAP systems to maintain. So the use case for some of these tools, as I described, is quite limited, and they can be only used in very specific circumstances. And some of these tools aren't really that flexible and don't cater for actual business requirements. So you have to consider that before you actually decide to use any of these functions. Let's take an example of a customer with 20,000 employees, 15,000 SAP users and 20 systems. Now, it's unlikely all 15,000 SAP users are going to have access to all 20 systems, but if this client has on average 5,000 users per system, that means they're going to have 100,000 user classifications across all systems to maintain prior to a license audit. So that's obviously quite a lot of work, and it's time consuming, so you'd have to prepare well in advance to get that work done. But it really should be done to make sure these user classifications are correct. You could end up non-compliant or significantly over-licensed if you're not fulfilling these processes. So here we have an example of a user who's currently a professional, and that is because their professional classification in System 1 is the highest prevailing user classification. We do some analysis of what they're actually doing in each system. We find out that their use of the software is more akin to that of an employee, and we update their classifications accordingly. So they are now an employee in System 1 and System 2, and they remain a logistics user in System 3. In this case, LAW would read that the logistics user classification is the highest prevailing classification, and that user would now be consuming a logistics user license. Whilst that is more expensive than an employee, it's actually 3 times cheaper than a professional user license. So you can understand when you multiply that across a population of thousands of SAP users, how critical it is to actually fulfill these processes and make sure all users are correctly licensed and that they are reviewed periodically to make sure they are correct. So most customers are classifying a user once when they are created, and they don't have any standard processes for periodically reviewing user classifications to keep them optimized, compliant, and up to date. It's important to implement processes to periodically review user classifications in order to keep them compliant, optimized, and up to date. And this, of course, helps to manage and optimize and minimize licensing costs. Customers should be reviewing user classifications once a quarter to keep them up to date. However, at the very least, this should be done once annually in advance of an audit. Customers should plan for this review process well in advance of the license audit to ensure that users can be updated, and the commercial impact of the change that has occurred, that can be measured to see if more license need to be purchased, or we can identify and understand what surplus licensing stock that we have. User population management. So licensing users is one thing, but licensing the correct number of users is an entirely different aspect of your preparation. So SAP customers need to manage their active user population. Only active users should be consuming a named user license. Inactive users need to be locked and expired correctly. And again, this helps manage SAP licensing costs. So here we have an example of a user population. We have the user count per license type. We identify a number of inactive users across various different SAP landscapes, and these users can be expired. A method of calculating if a user is inactive or not, it could be someone who's been inactive for 90 days or 120 days, for example. So customers need to determine what parameters to utilize for that analysis. But typically, if a user hasn't used the system for 3 months or longer, you might assume that they aren't accessing SAP anymore, and therefore their account can be locked and expired. So here we have the impact of change. We're reducing and right-sizing the user population so that we are consuming the right number of SAP licenses. And so again, we need to be analyzing and keeping active user accounts up to date, well in advance of the license audit. To expire a user properly, they need to be locked, and a valid to date needs to be set in the past. So it's no use just locking a user out of their account. If you do not set the valid to date in the past, they will continue to consume a license. And that's just one of the administrative nuances of managing SAP systems and licenses that can lead to users continuing to consume a license. Another common one is a system where you have a vacant classification. It's simply been missed as an administrative error, and that user would automatically be assigned a full professional license in that system, and that would then prevail over any other classification that's been managed properly, and they would inadvertently be consuming a full professional license. So administratively, you have to have everything up to date and up to scratch in order to make sure you're not over-consuming or inadvertently consuming too many licenses or too expensive licenses. So if not administered properly, accounts can continue to be counted by USMM and therefore subject to licensing. So automated user analysis and optimization using samQ. These are just a few simple points just so you understand how you can automate some of these processes using a software tool. So samQ comes pre-configured and it recognizes over 120,000 standard SAP transactions, and that means it knows by virtue of what someone's doing what license they will need in the SAP system. And it comes with a lot of out-the-box license templates, but you can configure it to match and license the license types in your contract. So it's got all these different templates, and you can that allows it to identify different user profiles accurately. You can customize it with different use rights for different license types. It automatically analyzes user activity to classify users with the cheapest compliant license type, and it can be set up to automatically identify and expire inactive users, so thus helping you manage your active user population. It's got a one-click write-back function, so once you've performed an analysis or you're reviewing the results of a monthly or quarterly analysis, you've got a one-click write-back function, and it rewrites all the corrective changes to all the SAP systems instantly. So the analysis is done automatically, and the administration of the system is also automated for you. It can be configured to do that automatically, so you don't even have to click a button. It literally will just do that all in the background, keeping everything tidy. It can also analyze and optimize users automatically, so you can set it up to run quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily, as regularly as you want, keeping things up to date. And it can also look at things like assigned authorizations, so you can understand what your max risk potential could be as a result of an enhanced license audit. So lots of useful deep dive analysis. Here's an example of, this is a real example of a samQ customer, but it could be any customer who performs adequate license preparation steps. We have a customer with 5,350 user accounts consuming a license. The customer is currently consuming very expensive license types, and the total consumption is 7.2 million worth of licenses. They're 150 licenses short, and that's bad news because they have a total license level of only £4 million. Here we can see the optimized position. So the customer has inactivated all of their inactive user accounts, and they've managed to optimize the active user population by 5% and reduce the number of active accounts down to 5,075. Users, as you can see from the list, the users have been optimized and reclassified to the cheapest compliant license type. Apologies. This has helped to reduce the consumption of expensive licenses and better utilizing cheaper licenses from the contracts. And we can see that the overall impact of that, hopefully I get my slide progression correct, is that the actual value of licenses consumed has dropped from 7.3 million down to 3.5 million. Whilst there are some licenses they are short of, they actually have a net surplus of 474k. So the shortfall they have of 424,000 of certain license types is quite minimal, but they have a surplus of 700,000 in other license types, which can be traded to cover those gaps. So there we see a potential over licensing of 4 million if they licensed according to existing system configurations, and that risk has been mitigated by correctly doing the optimization analysis, classifying users correctly in accordance with the contract, but also with the cheapest compliant license type, and the customer is in a much better position going into the license audit. So the next step, once users have been licensed properly and reflecting actual user licensing requirements, nice, tidy and optimized, we need to take a look at SAP Packages. So customers should be checking package license consumption in advance of an SAP license audit. Customers can review product metrics to gather values from business units independently of using the LAW tool. So what do I mean by that? Well, all you have to do to review the compliance of any given product, read your contract, identify the license metric. That could be number of sales orders processed in a year. It could be gigabytes of data or memory utilized. Whatever the metric is, SAP LAW or audit tools, these tools access the exact same data values that reside in data tables in your SAP systems. And normally, it might be a technical metric that does need some kind of analysis or technical discovery, but it's nothing you can't do manually as long as you're speaking to the right person, whether it's a functional lead or a basis or a security analyst. Lots of these metrics, like I said, relate to actual business transactions like sales orders. And for example, your sales and distribution function within your business will probably be able to tell you how many orders you're processing a year. All data measured by the tool is available in the SAP systems and to system users. You can, of course, run a simulation using LAW, and that will help you preview the measurement values. I'll talk a little bit later about running a pre-audit simulation, but as part of your preparation, you can run LAW without actually sending any data to SAP, and you can do a pre-review of what values it's giving out. And normally, if you basically look at an LAW report, you can there are online resources where you can look at the measurement data sheet online for any given SAP product. That helps you understand the information that you're being given in the LAW report, and that will help you determine if if LAW is actually measuring the right value. I'll give you a little example. APO licensed on planning sites and previously on planning locations. Well, if half of SAP customers bought the product on planning sites and the other half bought it on planning locations, LAW can't possibly be measuring both values. So who's actually getting the right number out of the tool? Well, that's a common problem, is that license metrics are always changing, and that's why it's absolutely crucial that you review SAP packages and product metrics well in advance of a license audit. And it can involve looking at some product measurement resources online to try and correlate that to the data in your LAW report. And then you can determine if that matches what the license metric in your contract or not. So if SAP License Audit Workbench is measuring different metrics to your contract, you may want to review the SAP support notes for a fix. So remember, I told you about implementing the SAP support notes. Well, following this process might help you identify a corrective note that updates the measurement functionality, and all of a sudden that product is being measured correctly for your business. So make sure you do that. If it can't be fixed, take a note that a manual correction will need to be made to the measurement results when you send them to SAP. So if it's not measuring according to the metric that you purchased the product on, you really shouldn't declare that information without highlighting the fact that it's an inaccurate measurement value, and you may want to declare something else. It's also very useful to gather self-declaration product values. Of course, they are self-declaration products because they can't be measured by LAW or standard SAP tools, So these products, you're going to have to gather these values from the business manually anyway. Because these are self-declared, it's vital that you declare the correct value to avoid both under and over licensing. Over declaring the use of a product accidentally can obviously lead to significant costs. For each product, be absolutely clear on the metric and the description in your contract, and make sure you gather the correct usage value from the business when you're doing that. You can also find measurement information documentation on all self-declaration products and individual product metrics on SAP's support portal. So there's information there, you can use it. If you don't know how to navigate all these resources or how to correlate those to the metrics in your contract, you can always speak to a VOQUZ Labs expert for help with your preparations. So these resources can help you understand how the metric is to be measured, and therefore you can understand how that product needs to be declared in line with the information in your contracts. So customers should understand any license gaps, and you should be able to understand license gaps, and you should be able to forecast purchasing requirements well in advance of a license audit. So one of the major complaints about using standard SAP tools is they don't offer any visibility or transparency over licensing costs. It's a very reactive model, and we had that diagram at the beginning of the presentation where you're just aggregating licensing entitlements year on year. You don't know until you've returned your annual audit what you're actually liable to pay, and that's not really an effective way of running your SAP environments. You should really be keeping a close control of how you're using the software. You should be able to forecast and manage licensing gaps and proactively procure and buy licenses according to demand within your business. Yeah, well, another useful point is that sounds difficult work, but again, if you're using a tool, samQ, for example, automatically gathers USMM files from every single live SAP environment or system in your environment. It then takes all those measures and consolidates them and gives you single product views for every measured product in your SAP estate. So you can see consumption over time and the change in consumption. You can do product comparisons and whatnot. So again, using a tool, why do this all manually? Why not use a tool to automate that analysis and just have ready on-demand reports, within a tool to help you monitor and control that effectively. So here you can see a kind of standard samQ report showing various different licensing attributes of products that are in use across the SAP estate. Another thing you would probably need to do, worth mentioning, when I go back, the equivalent or the alternative to having a tool that automates information gathering and reporting would be to maintain your own ELP. So an ELP is an effective licensing position document. There you would have all of your entitlements, all your license metrics and license product attributes. You would then gather manually or via LEW simulation measurement values for all of your products. And there you have your own consolidated view of all product usage. And that would probably be the product of all of these processes if you're doing them without a tool. So that would be the equivalent. A tool automates it all, but there are techniques you can use like maintaining an ELP to help you manage compliance. So preparing for indirect access, well, use of SAP systems via connected third-party system needs to be licensed according to most agreements. Terms and conditions governing indirect access can be found in contracts. Most customers will now be using SAP's LEW 2.0. LEW provides very limited data for indirect access, whereas LEW 2 specifically collects data on transactional activity running through technical user accounts, and this can be an indication of potential indirect use. So depending on the data they get, this can prompt SAP to investigate further to ensure indirect use is licensed correctly. Customers should be reviewing the use of their third-party systems that are connected to SAP to ensure this usage is licensed correctly, and customers should be licensing indirect use proactively to avoid non-compliance being discovered as a result of a license audit. Much better that it's discovered and you can give SAP a nice big thumbs up to say, no, we're well licensed for that, thank you very much. preparing for indirect access, again, just an illustration. So here, this is the most simple illustration of indirect access I can give you. We have a series of third-party systems that are connected to ERP via an interface. One system, we have 500 users. It could be a finance system. 300 users could be a logistics system. And 200 users could be an expenses or some sort of employee self-service platform. If you have just 1,000 unlicensed indirect users, this could cost you £1 million at net license prices. That would be like approximately £1,000 each. At list price, of course, this could cost you 3 times higher. And of course, there are some nasty conditions in your SAP contract that say that license fees that result or out of compliant licenses discovered as the product of a license audit can be charged at the then list price. So very important you read your contracts to identify if you're subject to those kind of conditions, because it basically opens up the possibility that when you're non-compliant, you might have to pay full price. And if you're on a discount of 60%, for example, that would mean being charged 3 times what you would normally pay. So productive third-party systems connected to SAP need to be monitored for this closely for this reason. Licensing requirements need to be determined. This can include package licenses for certain processes and for use of certain functionality in SAP. So it's not just users you need to pay attention to. And of course, the bottom line is you need to make sure you are compliant at all times. Here we have an indirect access activity report from samQ. So it's automatically gathering this data in the background. So you have it before SAP. It can differentiate between different transactional types and the volume of transactional activity to give you a nice big red flag warning as to a particular interface or third-party system that is being very productive, exchanging a lot of data with SAP, and that could be something you need to investigate to make sure it's licensed properly. Of course, if you've subscribed to the digital document licensing model, samQ has that covered as well. So it has the full functionality to count all the different document types and sub-document types, including sub-document types that are to be measured at the line item level. Of course, if you don't have a tool, that may be challenging to monitor out with the scope of an annual license audit. Last but not least, running a simulation. Once you've performed all your usage analysis, user classifications, and cleanup actions, you should run an LEW simulation before sending the data to SAP. LEW results should be checked to ensure the data being sent reflects what you expect. LEW results should be checked against your own records, for example, if you've maintained an ELP document. And if the simulation is okay, then I would recommend only at that stage do you actually send the data to SAP. If you use a tool like samQ License Optimizer, you can actually run as many simulations as you want without touching LEW. So that's available at the click of a button. And of course, if you're running the software, it's already automating the data collection in the background, and you've got on-demand reports to tell you your licensing position. When audit time comes, all your licenses should already have been optimized. So again, as per the last point there, that's going to reduce the actual preparation activities that you need to perform by about 80%, and it puts you firmly in control of the license audit process. And as well as it's a very monotonous process having to do this each and every year, you can actually configure samQ to automatically gather all the usage files that's running, automating the USMM transaction, gathering all these files and automatically populating them into the relevant target folder so that they can then be consolidated by LEW. So you could find yourself not having to actually run those processes again if you deploy tools that can automate those processes for you. Audit preparation planning. In terms of all the steps I've illustrated to you, if you're not using a SAM tool, you can expect to take 8 weeks of effort, I'd say minimum 8 to 10 weeks to make those necessary preparations. And then you would want to consider then actually processing the self-declaration and sending that to SAP. If you're doing that and if you're doing it as a one-off project using samQ, you can expect that to be reduced to 2 weeks. So again, if you need to prepare in shortened timeframes, you can use a tool to automate all that analysis, cleanup and optimization activity, and all the reporting, all the simulations. You can do audit preparation using samQ to help you get that done really quickly, efficiently, and accurately. Customers who are already running samQ, well, samQ is automatically in the virtue of having run and automating these processes while installed, it's actually already done the work, and come audit time, you have all the reports and information that you actually need in advance of the audit itself, and your preparation time really is just due diligence, and that might take you a couple of days as opposed to the standard kind of 2 months time frame you might otherwise be expending. So conclusions wise, it's vital that you optimize your user management processes. Ideally, you want to be managing users through the year and optimizing at least in advance of an audit. You want to look at all the relevant license audit processes and management activities to make sure law configuration, support notes, product documentation, the audit scope. You want to make sure you've got all the processes in place to make sure you're managing the audit and you're in control of the process. You want to look at your package license measurements well in advance of an audit, and that can throw up a few nasty surprises. A great example of that is enhancement packs that actually update LEW itself. You can find that 1 year a product you have licensed is not measurable, and then having updated the measurement functionality, all of a sudden that product is measurable. And if you are out of compliance on that product, you're going to get a nasty surprise, having been blissfully aware of a latent issue in years prior. So making sure that you take ownership of all your package measurements is vital. Indirect access monitoring is pretty critical, and again, that's simply so you don't get any nasty surprises, making sure you're right licensed and compliant in advance of a license audit. So thanks everyone for watching the presentation. I'm just going to take a quick look at any questions that have come in. I'm a little bit of a novice at going through the questions, so Francisco, can you help me at all in just reviewing any of the questions that have come in?
Yes, forget about most of the questions. We had an issue with the screen, but there is a participant asking, is it a good practice to use multi-client classification? I asked him to precise the question. I'm not sure I understand the question, honestly speaking.
Well, multi-client classification, I'm presuming that means you're actually going to classify the user the same way in multiple system environments. Well, really, if that is what the question is, you should be classifying each user specific to how they're using any given client or system environment. So if it's a manufacturing system or ERP or a finance or HR system, they should be classified, the classification should be unique to that system. However, on the other hand, if you know that a user is a professional in one system, in theory, you could just blanket classify that user as a professional in all systems, because they're going to end up, that classification will prevail in the end. So yeah, I mean, hopefully that answers the questions, but you should be, to make sure users are optimized, their classification needs to be optimized in each system they are using. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah.
Do we have any more?
Yeah, we have someone asking, does samQ have a SAP contract management system?
Contract management system. Well, samQ can't provide you with any reporting on product performance unless it knows what your license levels are. I wouldn't refer to it as a contract management system, but what you do need to do as an SAP customer is keep your contracts up to date. You can input all your license inventory into samQ, but that information has to come from keeping accurate records of your licensing entitlements through good SAP contract management. For example, if you maintain an ELP or an inventory, you simply upload the inventory into samQ, and that obviously remains configured perpetually. And each time you make a purchase, simply update the inventory accordingly. So I wouldn't refer it to as a contract management solution, but you can input your entitlements into samQ and it will recognize them. and it will gather product measurement values in accordance with those licensing entitlements and products that you put in the software.
So then we have someone asking, how do you classify business warehouse and business planning and consolidation users on business warehouse?
Business planning and consolidation. That is a tricky one. I mean, you have to read the user type definitions in the contract. You have to look at whether they are creating new documents and transactions in SAP. Are these professional level activities, or are they more like, view only? So in business warehouse, you can have people who are simply looking at data or looking at reports, and they would need a lower license level. They could even need some kind of business expert or business analytics license. Otherwise, if they're actually changing, manipulating data, creating reports, then they would most certainly need a professional license. Again, why bother with the hassle of these things? If you get it right the first time round, simply configure that into a tool to recognize these transactions and business activities, and a tool is going to automatically classify that user with the correct license, and you never have to worry about it again. Once you've correctly correlated the user types into samQ inventory, and you've accurately configured the licensing templates for what each of those user licenses permits in the SAP system, the software is going to automatically look for users whose activity correlates to these license types, and will automatically license those users. But hopefully I've answered the question in both ways, but yeah, hopefully that's an okay answer.
Yeah. Then we have another question. Someone's asking us, can you help to create category classification rules, or is this purely based on individual user license and license types?
Just go through it again one more time.
Yeah, can you help to create category classification rules? So the question is, how does at all, and the same person asks later, how can we ensure that license classifications is optimal with your tool? Now, we have different aspects of the question. First of all, we base our classification of users mainly on use rights and activities of users in the system or authorizations of users in the system. You first of all need to check, what does your SAP contract say? Is it based, are your use rights based on authorizations or on activities of the users? So this is one. But then again, of course, sometimes you are in a situation where you need to work with categories like application components, user groups, etc. And depending on the client's size, the client's complexity, geographical separation, etc., you definitely can create rules to match your specific needs and reflect your situation. Some examples, I have a client who has a specific user license, custom user license for his more than 4,000 call center users. In that case, of course, we need to configure this specific license type. And this license type is in that case just manually assigned to everyone who is in a certain user group in SAP. This is a specific situation of a client. The rest of the users with that client, they get their licenses assigned based on their activity profile. So yes, you can almost do anything in terms of categorization, specific rules, profiling of users to reflect that. So what more do we have?
Just to add to that, look, we have a customization suite, and you can more or less configure any licensing rules into that, and using that customization suite. You can do it by user groupings. You can, for example, you can do it by functional component. So samQ can go out for looking for users that belong to a certain user group and license them accordingly. It can do it by functional component. So by virtue of someone using SAP MM and one of the subsequent module components within MM, you can basically say, well, if anyone's using that particular module, they must be a logistics warehouse user, shop floor worker, limited or professional user. So it's very flexible in making sure that you set up the tool to license users in accordance with the contract. It's simply about reading and understanding what's in your contract and configuring that accordingly into samQ.
Then we have a last question. Does samQ provide authorization-based classification or usage-based classification?
Both, actually. So you can switch between the two, which isn't recommended. You should choose one principle. If you want to take a very low risk approach, but it's probably going to be slightly more expensive, is you would license according to assigned authorizations. Really, you should be licensing according to the optimal license type a user needs, which is according to transactional usage. And if you have a gap between the licensing position based on usage and assigned authorizations, it's probably a result of your security concept and how you're maintaining SAP roles. That likely is an indication that users are being assigned roles that are in excess of what they actually need. They may not even be using these roles, so why license them accordingly? But yeah, look, one thing you can do is you can set samQ to license according to transactions or any kind of licensing rule sets, and you can actually compare per system, per license type, per user, per system. You can do all manner of drill downs to look at the difference between licensing based on transactions and licensing based on assigned authorizations. Take Mike Brown. By transactions, he's a limited or an employee, and by assigned authorizations, he is a full professional. Not only that, you can actually drill down into all the systems that Mike is using and understand where and why he has authorizations in excess of his actual use. So you might be able to identify that it's one single system, and Mike just needs certain roles removed, and all of a sudden he can be optimized to a cheaper license type. So yeah, it's quite powerful functionality in that regard as well.
Yeah, so definitely the question is, the answer is yes. We do support both rules for classification. So usage-based or authorization-based, you can choose between them. And we have a function to compare the financial outcome of both options and see which one would fit better to your organization. And with this, we have come to the end of the questions as far as I can see, Jan.
Okay, questions done. Well, just bringing everyone's attention back to what's on screen. We do have a great LinkedIn page. All senior consultants in the business are regularly posting articles, webinars, events, and key insights, interesting stories. So please go to our LinkedIn page, hit follow and subscribe and follow VOQUZ Labs. Again, a great way of getting all the latest content. Our contact details, myself and Francisco, our email addresses are there below. If you need any help, you've got any further questions you want to ask in private about license audits, or in fact, if you've got a license audit coming up and you need help either from our professionals or you want to use our software to help you prepare, analyze and optimize in advance of an audit, do get in touch and let us know what support you need, and we'll gladly discuss that with you. So based on that, I think that draws to a conclusion today's webinar. Again, thank you very much everyone for attending, and we hope to see you here again soon.
Yeah,
thanks
thank you everyone. Everyone will get a link to the presentation so that you have a copy of it. You can also watch this webinar again if you need to check something on our website. Thank you everyone, and thank you Jan for this interesting webinar. Have everyone a good week.
Bye everyone.
Bye.